pull aside the curtain that normally hides all of this in the sphere of private life of these people. It was by Pier Pasolini, great Italian director, 100 Days of Sodom. And it was a kind of in-your-face depiction of Jeffrey Epstein-like activities among, I think, Mussolini fascism's elite. I was reminded of a movie that I found very disturbing years ago. It was by Pier Pasolini, an Italian director, a great Italian director, and it was called, I believe the title was 100 Days of Sodom or something close to that. And it was a kind of in-your-face depiction of Jeffrey Epstein-like activities among, I think, Mussolini fascism's elite in Rome or whatever government was enacted in that culture. Because it seemed to me that that movie was trying very hard to make us look at what is a key dimension of that society, but carefully kept from public view, even when it happens in public. And it's almost as though you're dealing here with people who want to get caught on some level, but can't quite bring themselves to do it. So that leads me then to wonder, not that people in high places are doing this. I think that's always been true. I think that when you have social systems or communities in which a very few people have extraordinary wealth and power, that a dynamic sets up which ends up in this kind of behavior, among other kinds. That the disconnect of the few at the top from the many below them will have, sooner or later, sexual dimensions and transgressive, I'm being careful here, sexual implications. So I don't find that surprising, and I don't find it surprising that it finally sees the light of day. I think that in a peculiar kind of social justice, the mass of people want, if you allow me the metaphor, to pull aside the curtain that normally hides all of this in the sphere of private life of these people. There's a kind of voyeuristic pulling back the curtain so it's all out there for everyone to think about, talk about, gawk at, and so forth. So what am I left with? Well, where my brain takes all of this is I think all Americans, I really do, I think we all know this. I think there's something stunningly unsurprising, and not just for you and me, but for everybody. It's in the newspaper because everyone says to himself or herself or to his partner or her partner, I knew it, a kind of, even if they didn't, you want, well, what is it you want? You want this not to be a surprise. So here's my conclusion. There are many things, and I learned this from my wife, who's, as you know, a psychotherapist. For a long time, she marveled at the frequency with which the people who came to see her for help had as children a trauma of incest of one kind or another. And what fascinated her, and she taught me, I hadn't thought about it, was not that it's so widespread, although she had to learn that, she didn't know that, but that it has always been handled in our culture precisely in the opposite. In other words, we all know what that is, but we all think it happens very rarely and to isolated people in some mountain backwater of Maine or West Virginia or something like that, not to demean those states, but the imagery of an isolated, that's where we left it in our conversations, she and I. And all of that comes back to me now. We all know and I think we're right, that this is everywhere in a society as unequal as ours. And yet we are needful, even including you and me, of somehow acting as if it was very exceptional. I even had the thought before we began this conversation right now that somehow maybe this is not an appropriate topic for you and me because it is so atypical, when I in fact don't believe that. I spent 10 years of my life, from the day I began as a freshman to the day I got my PhD. The first 4 years of those 10 years were spent at Harvard. Then I spent a year at Stanford, and then I spent the next 5 years at Yale. So I have spent 10 years of my life endlessly circulating with the Larry Summers, including him, on more than one occasion. Right? Just being in a room, in a seminar, a session, in a cocktail party, or whatever it was, at the academic, as I went through, the academic hoops. And what you call common, or what you just told us about that email, that's the norm. That's kept encountering it. I kept being, I don't mind admitting it, somewhat shocked because the family I came out of had not prepared me for this. My parents shipped me off to Harvard saying, you're going to a temple of learning, the great university. I mean, not particularly that it was Harvard, but the university where there is a great library, and you will be taken through the highest products of civilization. That kind of mentality shit went off the university with me. So I wasn't ready for any of this. By the way, I wasn't ready for it among the students, and I wasn't ready for it among the faculty, nor in the relationships between them. But by the time I was done with my 10 years, I was able to say what I'm telling you now. It is the norm. And there's another dimension of this, I think, which proves it. All of these people, Barclays bank executive, whose name I forget, Ehud Barak, highest official of Israel, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, they all went on that airplane to an island where young girls who obviously don't live on the island were present and were being interacted with, as careful as I can be. They didn't think to themselves, this could be recorded. This could be filmed. I am taking chances with my own life and my own career and my own marriage. And what am I doing? This is the most compulsive behavior you could imagine. The risks, a Bill Clinton who might have missed being the president because he had been caught earlier, if you remember, running around the couch in a motel room after a secretary or whoever the woman was, and who had all the Monica Lewinsky catastrophe. And so they are so used to this. They are so used to getting away with it that the notion that I'm at risk here doesn't occur to them. Why? Because this is so normal, a regular procedure. It's like people in the subway here in New York City. If you're in a crowded subway, you're going to get bumped because, you're packed like sardines. And there's someone brushing against you, nothing happens. You don't turn on that person. You barely notice it. Why? Because you understand you're in the subway. That's the way it is. And women and men bump up against assumedly most of the time, it's a non-event. For these people, getting on an airplane to this, having heard, which they must have, that this guy has gotten into trouble for pedophilia, been hauled into court, which suggests the trouble is serious, blah, blah, blah. Didn't matter. It didn't matter. It's famous in academic circles, this story of the quote-unquote senior male professor surrounded by young women who are, in their 20s or maybe in their 30s. And the power situation in there is so lopsided. The fate of the young woman. Will she get an A? Will she get a good reputation in the department? Will she get her degree? Will she get a letter of recommendation that will boost her into a job or not? All of that depends on pleasing this man. When you know that the emotional maturity of most academics, at least those I've met, is, how shall I put it, underdeveloped. You put together an underdeveloped male professor in a position of power, extraordinary power, and a ambitious young woman who wants to succeed at what she's giving herself to as a student. You have a recipe for what indeed happens all the time. When I was at Harvard as a student, we were all told about the Kennedy family. Everybody who was a student talked about it. First of all, the Kennedys weren't that much older than us anyway as students, and they were famous that the two brothers, John and Robert, had endless affairs with endless women that were procured for them. And then there was the story of the third brother, Chappaquiddick, if you remember, that
Right, sure.
accident, and abandoning a young woman there and all the rest of it. And we were all presented with that story as if it wasn't notable. Or let me put it differently, it was only notable because the Kennedys were famous. Otherwise it wouldn't have been noted, because it was so normal, it was so rampant, it was so everywhere, and women didn't speak about it because they were ashamed. They would get blamed for whatever happened. It would not be the man who got blamed. The worst he would have is he got caught, but not blamed. Whereas the woman would suffer, extraordinary blame and abuse, including from her own friends, her own family, and on and on and on and on. So I think what happens is at the end, it overflows. It becomes a hysteria of the men who perpetrate and of the culture that kind of now demands to see it. And I'm struck with this one because it was known. We had all heard about it, whatever it is, 6 or 7 years ago. And here we're recycling the whole thing. I mean, this is a culture that wants to deal with this. It doesn't allow the president to sweep it under the rug. In my 10 years in the Ivy League, I saw that all the time. People in positions of power who had a fellow feeling, let's call it, for others in a position of power, and saw all this as threatening. This would be, I'm going to make up a case. This is not a real story, but this would be I'm going to exaggerate even further. Let's assume a woman president of a college who hears about a faculty member or administrator under her in the pecking order who is inappropriate with some young lady or something like that, or some man for that matter. She will, 9 times out of 10, she will not intervene in a public way. And that's because she wants to protect the institution. I had a friend, he's no longer alive, so I can quote him, and he can't refute what I say. He was a policeman at Yale University, working for the Yale Police Department. And I got to know him because babysitters for my children came from his family. So we got to know them. And he used to tell me what was his instruction when there were sexual improprieties. He used words like that, between students and the surrounding community. Well, much of the surrounding community at Yale University in New Haven is African American. I mean, it's a black ghetto. And so now you had the added issue. You could have a sexual interaction between a white and a black person, adding all of that drama to it all. He would tell me there's a whole procedure. They would not, if the police were involved like him and he had to go and rescue somebody or break up something, how he was to handle it. And the whole rigmarole, the whole procedure was to maximize the probability that nothing would get into the newspaper.
Hmm.
If an arrest was made, it had to be done in such a way. If there would be a police record, it had to be managed in such a way, because the number one thing was not to allow it to become not common knowledge that if you sent a child who of 18 years of age or whatever to Yale University, male or female, they could get caught up in what in fact they could get caught up in. This had to be hidden. And there was an unspoken commitment to keep it hidden. And so there were both hetero and homosexual events all the time that many of us knew about because a friend was involved, or we happened to be there, or it was a party that got out of control. And we all learned very quickly how the university handles this, which is what event. So, yeah, I think it's easy to show you. I could show you that a young man, or for that matter, a young woman who comes to Yale and goes through that, or Harvard or Stanford, it's all the same, is literally trained without knowing it in how to manage this part of life quietly,
Hmm.
silently. In other words, they become complicit in making believe it isn't the norm, even though they personally know that it is. We are saying this is what the peak of power in late capitalism in the United States looks like. Don't fool yourself. Just like we would have otherwise perhaps discussed what goes into the mentality of a president and of an administration that wants to reduce the food stamp program for
Right.
42 million. I mean, what are you telling the whole world you're doing, as you organize a war against Venezuela? You're squeezing the food stamp. I mean, it is so grotesque that it has to be spoken because of what you just said, that it's showing people something, and they need to confront it.